Good morning, and thank you for joining us for worship here at United Church in Rockville Center, New York. My name is Scott Russman, and I'm the pastor and teacher here at United Church. This is worship for the week of August 9th, 2020. As we begin our worship service this morning, hear these words to the call to worship. For those who will listen, let them hear. God will speak peace to God's people, to God's faithful, to those who turn to God in their hearts. God's salvation is at hand for those who fear God. When our living is right in God's eyes, when justice makes a path for God's steps, steadfast love and faithfulness meet, righteousness and peace kiss each other. Faithfulness springs up from the ground. Justice looks down from the sky. The Lord gives what is good. Our land yields in abundance. God's glory dwells among us. Come, let us worship God. Let us listen to the words from Scripture. This morning we hear from the Gospel according to Matthew. We're at chapter 14, beginning at verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." What do you think of the story that I just read? A bit unbelievable, isn't it? It's another miracle story, hot on the heels of the feeding of the 5,000. For some reason, perhaps with another miracle in mind, Jesus instructed the disciples to go on ahead of him, to cross the Sea of Galilee, and we are to assume that somehow Jesus would catch up with them in due time. The disciples did as they were told, and Jesus stayed behind to dismiss the crowd. Notice the urgency in Jesus' command to the disciples. The translation that I read just a moment ago says that immediately he made the disciples. The Message translation states that as soon as the meal was finished, Jesus insisted. Other translations mark a similar urgency. As Gospel writer Matthew is often given to do, he writes with earnestness, one story building upon another as the narrative moves along. Note also that Jesus made or insisted that the disciples do as he asked. There appeared to be no room for negotiation. No, "We'll stay back and keep the crowds from following you." No alternate suggestions. Jesus says to go, and the disciples do as he asks. The text does tell us that Jesus wanted to spend some time alone, which was his intent prior to the feeding of the 5,000. But the needs of the crowd won over Jesus' need for rest and recreation. Jesus wanted to go to the mountain to pray. Mountains are important in the biblical text, because that's generally an indication that whoever is going up the mountain will encounter God on the mountain. So it was with Jesus. He climbed the mountain alone and prayed. We would not be incorrect to assume that the prayer was a conversation with God, rather than the one-sided prayers that often characterize our prayer lives. The text tells us that Jesus stayed there alone. We should picture the scene. While we don't know how tall the mountain was or how far up the mountain Jesus went, we do know that there would have been darkness all around. The only light from the moon and stars, or perhaps a torch that Jesus might have taken with him. The point is that Jesus was not afraid, not anxious about being alone in what could have been a dangerous environment. Not afraid, because he knew that God was with him. While the disciples are crossing the sea, the wind kicks up. Those of us living on Long Island had a demonstration this past week of just how powerful the wind can be. The water in the Sea of Galilee is known for going from calm to stormy in the blink of an eye. Cold air from the mountains collides with the warm air of the sea, and a storm is created. The water, being relatively shallow, increases the waves quickly. Like what would happen if we were carrying a bowl of water across the room. We feel for the disciples, for their predicament. This was not an ideal place to be in the middle of the night. Let's say they had some light with them, but I would suggest that an open flame would have trouble staying lit in heavy wind, and probably had no place on a boat to begin with. One thing that the text doesn't mention is the biblical understanding of what the sea represented. While by day it provided for the livelihood of those who fished for a living, at night it was thought of as a place where evil resided. The darkness of night would allow evil to be unleashed, as represented by chaos. While the disciples would understand a sea or lake having a boundary, they would also know of tales of bigger seas, the oceans as we know them now, where people traveled and never returned. Surely such things were on their minds as the winds created chaos, and their boat was tossed about. They feared capsizing, and subsequently being at the mercy of evil. Who knew what would happen to them if they were thrown into the sea? Would they be swallowed up by chaos? Surely they also felt abandoned by Jesus during this time. Why had he insisted that they cross the sea? Could they have not spent the night where they were and waited until daylight to travel together? They could not know that Jesus was setting the scene for another miracle. We don't know how long the boat was battered about. But out of nowhere, Jesus came to them walking on the water. Most likely it was between 3 and 6 in the morning, meaning that the disciples had been contending with the chaos of the sea for quite some time. Now, the disciples don't recognize Jesus, and for good reason. Why on earth would they ever expect that Jesus would be walking on the water? The disciples believed Jesus to be a ghost. More correctly, I would argue, some kind of evil being coming to get them. Who could blame them? Jesus was quick to let the disciples know it was him. After all, what's unusual about someone walking on water in the midst of a storm in the middle of the night? But even with hearing his voice, they doubted. I must side with the disciples here. Why wouldn't they be full of doubt and fear? But Peter was bold, and he questioned this apparition. He too wanted to walk on water. Notice the text doesn't say anything about the waves calming down at this point. Peter was willing to enter the chaos of the sea to prove his trust in Jesus. I might be giving Peter more credit than is due, however. Peter simply might well have wanted to experience such supernatural power for himself. But let's say that Peter's motives were to demonstrate trust. Almost immediately upon walking on the sea, on the waves, Peter begins to sink. Now, we know that when one enters the water from a boat, you don't gradually sink. You fall right in. It's almost as if Peter's faith, Peter's trust in Jesus was faltering. It wasn't strong enough to keep him afloat, yet wasn't weak enough to plunge him full force into the sea. I find that fascinating because it's very indicative of our faith. Sometimes when chaos enters our lives, and we've all had chaos enter our lives, the intensity of our faith reactions to the chaos varies. Sometimes we take a few steps, walk on water of sorts, only to realize, wait, this isn't the way it's supposed to happen, and we begin to sink. We're not drowning, but we're not walking on water either. Our faith keeps us from drowning. Like Peter, we flail our arms a bit to keep our heads above water, to keep the chaos from overtaking us, even as the struggle and energy needed to keep us afloat is great. The miracle of Jesus walking on water isn't really about Jesus overturning the laws of the universe. Ordinary people don't walk on water, unless it's frozen, of course. No, the miracle was constructed to deepen the disciples' faith in Jesus. And it also served to speak to our faith as well. During a storm, where do you turn? First, I hope you do everything you can to keep yourself safe. But what happens when you feel overwhelmed by the storms of life? We might hear God telling us to take the next few steps of the journey in faith. And we might actually take a few steps. But then our fear overtakes us. And we begin to sink into the sea of despair and doubt. You know it happens. It's happened to me, and I'm sure it's happened to you. We think we can until we think we can't. And that's where faith meets doubt. Today's story tells us that Jesus didn't hesitate to reach out his hand to help the struggling Peter. The Message translation writes that Jesus said to Peter, "Faint heart, What got into you? I like that response. Not a condemnation, but more like, Peter, don't you know that I've got your back? And isn't that what we expect? What we hope for from God? I'll admit, I want a hand up from God more often than not. There have been times in my life when chaos was all around me, and I thought that my faith was strong enough to keep me from sinking further. But then I doubted my faith and my strength in the process. And the chaos seemed to be more than I could handle. Yet in all those times, God's hand was ready, willing, and able to pull me to a place where I felt safe, even as the waves continued to batter my soul. While this miracle helps the disciples to understand that this guy they're following is indeed God's Son, and this is their first acclamation of such in Matthew's Gospel, it speaks to us as well. But we shouldn't need a supernatural miracle to convince us that God stands ready to aid us whenever we are in need, to convince us that God cares for us deeply. Peter took a risk stepping onto the water. We need to give him credit for that. He was willing to trust God. What about the other disciples in the boat? Where was their faith? It was hanging on for dear life, even as life, the next step in their journey, was waiting in the midst of the chaos. Maybe that's an untapped lesson from the story as well. Sometimes we need to step into the chaos to discover God's presence. We can hide from the cancer diagnosis, or the son or daughter who's spiraling downward, or the bill collectors that keep calling, or the abusive relationship we find ourselves in. Or we can step into the chaos and allow our faith to assist us in finding God in the storm. Sometimes we have to risk stepping into the chaos because that is where God waits for us. My friends, I pray that my words have helped you to hear this story in a new way this day. Chaos is all around us right now, and it shows no sign of letting up. So let us be bold in our faith by stepping into such chaos with the assurance that God stands in the midst of chaos. Even as Jesus stood upon the raging sea, ready to reach out a hand to Peter and subsequently to us, to assist us and hold us upright as we take the next steps of our journey. So be it. Amen. May God bless you with joy. May you find moments of laughter and bliss in the midst of suffering and chaos. May you cherish those times and may they sustain you. May God bless you with the fruits of humility. May your humble and sacrificial actions be instrumental in preserving your community and loving your neighbors. May God bless you with peace. In the face of financial hardship and uncertainty, may you know the faithful presence of God, the God who provides. Go in peace, wash your hands, love your neighbors. You are not alone.